Brothers and sisters watching from across the Atlantic, I want you to picture something that feels almost impossible at first glance. A wide Sahel horizon, dusty and sun-baked, the kind of place many news cameras only visit when there's trouble. Now pull the camera down into a cool, humming room, lined with servers, cables neatly bundled, the air steady like a heartbeat. In the past, most of the data-shaping African lives flowed through machines far away, under oceans and across continents. But imagine that, within a short span, millions of everyday records, birth certificates, tax filings, farm reports, clinic logs, begin to live on African soil. Imagine dozens of small government offices that once depended on someone else's switch, now learning to stand on their own. Here is the question that decides the next century. If your information, your tools, and the artificial intelligence that guides decisions are seated in someone else's house, do you truly control your future? And if a group of nations says, "We will build our own house," whose nerves will that rattle? This is not a story about gadgets. It is about dignity, power, and the right to design your own tomorrow. At the start of 2025, in a city many Americans have never visited, a summit with an unromantic name drew a crowd that felt anything but ordinary. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, engineers in modest shirts stood next to officers in uniform. Farmers who had never coded a line sat beside academics who had written code for years. The phrase, Pan-African Digital Sovereignty Summit, sounded like a committee meeting, but the energy in the hall was closer to a declaration of independence. On screen, maps showed network cables snaking under seas and across deserts. On tables, prototypes of local software, pulsed with dashboards built in languages people actually speak at home. In the aisles, the conversations were simple and urgent. How do we keep our services running when someone else's system decides to fail? How do we fix a birth certificate problem without asking a vendor in another time zone for permission? How do we rebuild trust in public institutions that people have learned to avoid? For years, African governments did what seemed practical: rent a tool instead of building one, buy a platform instead of funding a team, send data away because the cloud was cheaper than bricks, steel, and local expertise. It was faster in the short run. It was also more fragile. A weather blip, a routing error, a policy change in a headquarters thousands of miles away. Suddenly a ministry could not process payments, a clinic could not pull a chart, a customs post could not see the database that tells it who is allowed to pass. No bullets, no tanks, just a glitch. And for citizens, the cost was measured in hours wasted, in jobs delayed, in opportunities lost. If you've ever waited at a DMV window and felt your patience drain, you know the feeling. Now imagine that experience multiplied by distance, by scarce buses, by a cell phone with a prepaid plan that runs out before your turn. Across Africa, people learned a hard rule. Where paperwork goes to hide, corruption learns to breathe. A missing file here, a fee there, a wink, a shrug, a week lost. The simplest act of citizenship, getting a document that proves you exist, could become a gamble. The promise of digital government was supposed to cure that. But if the logic of that digital system lives somewhere else, if the gatekeeper works for a company overseas and not for the public, then accountability is a long-distance call. The push in Ouagadougou was different. It said, the state must be measured not by marble buildings, but by the quality of service the poorest person receives. Build local platforms for routine tasks. Put citizen centers where people actually live, not only downtown. Log every signature, every upload, every payment in a traceable path that can be audited later. Take away the shadows where bad habits hide. In some offices, it now takes hours, sometimes minutes, to complete a process that used to take a week. That is not a miracle. That is what happens when rules are written in code instead of whispered in hallways. Here's where I'll speak to you directly, as plainly as I can. If Africa keeps relying on systems it did not design, someone else can press a key and stop a service. It happened. It will happen again. The question is not whether outside partners have good intentions. Many do. The question is who holds the switch. And when a country says, "From now on, our data stays at home," what unfolds behind the curtain? Before we go further, if this kind of straight talk matters to you, if you believe dignity is not a luxury, tap subscribe and stay with me. The most uncomfortable part is coming up next. There's an old story Americans know well. For a long time, raw materials left one shore, were refined somewhere else, and then sold back at a premium. Sugar, cotton, copper, you know the list. In the 21st century, the raw material is less visible. It's the river of data our phones, clinics, schools, border posts, and tractors generate every day. Not all data is treasure, but when it's pooled and refined, when it trains algorithms, informs policies, calibrates markets, it becomes influence. Call it digital colonization if you want to be blunt. You don't need a flag or a fort to profit from a place. You need to design the pipelines, run the platforms, write the rules for how information moves, and then bill for the privilege. The promise is always similar. It's cheaper, it's faster, and it's secure, until it isn't. And when costs rise or policies shift, the bill comes due to someone who didn't design the system and doesn't own the code. Why did so many governments take that bargain? Because building a secure data center, training engineers, retaining them against higher salaries overseas, paying for backup power, and cooling in hot climates, none of that is free. Because political cycles are short and infrastructure is a long game. Because foreign aid often arrives with a menu of best practices that favor hiring outside vendors. Because when you're told you can skip 10 steps for a low monthly fee, it's hard to say no. But underneath the convenience is a quiet surrender, the power to decide what is possible, when, and at what price moves offshore. Let's talk about who benefits when the data river flows outward. Technology firms, obviously. The more they host, the more they learn. They don't just store information, they analyze it, extract patterns, and use those patterns to build or sell products. Sometimes those products return to the same markets the data came from, repackaged and priced. Governments in powerful countries benefit too, with greater visibility into regions they consider strategically important. And then there are the well-meaning institutions, think tanks, NGOs, that warn about fragmenting the internet whenever a country insists on keeping data within its borders. You've heard those phrases before. When the United States or the European Union sets strict rules about data localization to protect citizens, the vocabulary is security, privacy, and resilience. When an African state says the same thing, the vocabulary becomes balkanization. The double standard is not subtle. Now, I want to turn toward the heart of the resistance and the heart of the hope. Resistance first. As soon as one nation says, "We keep our records here," a chorus will rise. It will be slower, it will be less innovative, it will scare investors, it will be unsafe. Some of that concern is honest. Poorly run systems can be dangerous. But some of it is theater, because the moment a government can enforce its own rules on its own soil, someone else loses the right to make money on that compliance. When you move the data home, you move the leverage too. And leverage is not something the current players give up without a public debate. So what changes when you stop renting the future and start building it? First, you take the oxygen away from small-time corruption. When every step in a process leaves a digital footprint that cannot easily be erased, a favor becomes a liability. Second, you make government predictable for ordinary people. A street vendor in Ouagadougou, the kind of woman who once took 3 bus rides, missed 2 days of sales, and handed over cash to a middleman just to renew a permit, can now walk into a digital citizen center near her neighborhood and finish the process before lunch. I'll call her Miriam. She doesn't care about network architecture. She cares that the number on her receipt matches the number in the system, that there is a date stamp, and that an officer can't lose her file anymore. Third, you create a foundation on which local developers can build. If the platform is domestic, a young engineer can fix what breaks without pricing in airfare and legal negotiations across borders. But let me tie this to security, because in the Sahel, you can't leave that out of the story. Terror networks in the region move faster than traditional bureaucracies. If your reaction time is measured in days, you lose. Artificial intelligence helps shorten that clock. It can sift through radio chatter and vehicle movements, detect patterns in how attacks develop, and flag anomalies that human eyes miss at scale. I am not talking about science fiction. I am talking about command posts that can see, on a map, the slow formation of a threat because an algorithm has been trained to notice when 10 ordinary signals line up in a suspicious way. The same logic applies to fraud at borders, to the spread of plant disease in a farming region, to the early signs of an epidemic in a district hospital's admissions. When AI is treated as a luxury good for rich countries, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When it is treated as a necessity for stability, it becomes a shield. Of course, there is risk. Technology is not a priest. It is a mirror. If you point it with bad intentions, it will magnify the worst in you. If a state builds capacity without building guardrails, data protection laws, independent oversight, transparent procedures, then keeping data at home can simply move the abuse closer to the victim. That is why responsible voices inside Africa emphasize not just sovereignty, but ethics. Keep the data, yes, but also protect the citizen against the state and the state against private capture. The sweet spot is not easy, but it exists. Systems strong enough to be useful, and rules strong enough to be trusted. Now, if everything I've said so far were only theory, it would be a nice speech and nothing more. But something else has been happening. Across the continent, in places Americans rarely see on evening news, a quiet awakening is beginning to echo. In Mali and Niger, planners who once pinned paper maps to walls are learning to work on dashboards that update themselves. In Ghana and Rwanda, the talk in universities includes not just how to attract outside firms, but how to raise local ones. In Kenya and Senegal, the instinct to build for local languages and customs, not just to translate foreign menus, has found new energy. In Tanzania, in Benin, in Côte d'Ivoire, you can feel a shift when you visit small tech hubs. Young people want to write the code that runs their own towns, not just the code that amuses someone else's users. It is not a wave that will drown all problems. It is a current that helps boats move. So why is the reaction from outside sometimes so loud? Because power respects a status quo it understands. And the status quo that served the present leaders of the digital economy is simple. Data comes to us, services go to you. When you invert that, you make people nervous. Are they nervous for African citizens? Sometimes yes. Are they also nervous For their balance sheets and strategic visibility? You can answer that yourself. Let me tell you a story the way a reporter would. A government drafts a plan to move critical services onto a locally controlled platform. Meetings are held. The details are dull to read, but essential to implement. Power redundancy, cooling, security, procurement rules, the small stuff that decides whether the big stuff works. Then, in a matter of days, a swarm of commentary appears from far away. Articles warning of digital isolation, briefings on investment flight, memos suggesting risks to the open internet. Some concerns are technically valid. Many are cut and paste from older talking points. In private, lobbyists whisper a simpler message: don't do this. It will cost us money, and it will cost you friends. Here is the cliff's edge, the question we must not dodge. Are these caution flags genuine worry for the user in a village? Or are they the last defense of a business model that depends on other people's dependence? When data maps are drawn elsewhere, who sees what? When identities are verified elsewhere, who decides who counts? When algorithms are trained on behavior gathered far from where their consequences land, who pays the price for an error? If Africa keeps its data at home and writes its own rules at home, who loses not just revenue, but the habit of being in charge? I said we would follow the money, the data, and the contracts that few read. Let's do that. The quiet profit in hosting someone else's memory is not in the disk drive. It's in the analysis you can run while you're hosting it. If you hold the logs of how people move, buy, learn, and heal, you can build models that predict what they'll need next. Those models can make public services better, yes, but they can also make marketing sharper and pricing harder to escape. When the models are trained elsewhere, who owns them? If a health systems triage tool learns from African clinics and then gets packaged as a product for sale, how much of that value returns to where the learning occurred? If an ad network gets better at micro-targeting farmers because it coded itself in data scraped from local commerce, who pockets the spread between what an advertiser pays and what a farmer earns? Some will object. The only way to afford top-tier services is to let specialists do the work wherever they are. There is truth in specialization, but there is also truth in stewardship. A pastor will tell you that tithes and budgets are not the same thing. A veteran will tell you that outsourcing and command are not the same thing. A mayor will tell you that you cannot subcontract accountability. The point is not to close doors. The point is to decide which doors lead into your house and which doors lead out of it, and then to hold the keys with a firm hand. There is another, more delicate objection that comes from inside Africa itself, and it deserves respect. If we keep data at home, will our own governments use it against us? Will surveillance grow in the shadows of sovereignty? Will algorithms become tools to silence opposition rather than deliver services? These are real fears. Sovereignty without rights is just a new coat of paint on an old habit. The answer is not to give power away. The answer is to bind power to rules. Data protection laws can be written, enforced, and litigated. Independent oversight bodies can be staffed with people whose careers do not depend on the ruling party. Technical audits can be made routine and results published. There are Americans who know this from their own fights over privacy and surveillance. Freedom is not a download. It is a discipline. Now, if you have stayed with me this far, you're probably wondering whether there are enough hands to do the work. Servers and cables are metal and glass. But the soul of this project is people. And here, the most surprising news is the most hopeful. The greatest resource on the African continent is not gold or oil. It is the minds of young people who will not wait for permission. I met a young woman, I'll call her Aicha, who learned to code from videos on a borrowed phone and a second-hand laptop. In a small lab attached to a university, she and two friends built a simple tool for a clinic to track prenatal visits. It wasn't elegant, but it worked without an internet connection and synced when it found one. The nurses stopped guessing. The mothers stopped missing appointments as often. Aicha did not ask Silicon Valley to bless her. She started with what she had and improved it piece by piece. The story repeats in different clothes. In a town you'd have trouble pronouncing on your first try, a young man took apart broken drones and built one that could fly a straight line over a field. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to measure how a plant disease was spreading faster than the extension agent could drive. A local cooperative pooled money to buy him batteries and a better motor. He wrote the software himself, not because he preferred it, but because no one else would. This is what it looks like when you build from the ground up. It's not flashy, it's persistent. Governments can help or hurt that spirit. The helpful ones invest in polytechnic universities, where students touch equipment instead of just reading about it. They fund innovation labs where a bad idea can fail without ending a career. They pay for stable internet at public institutions instead of cutting the budget when the economy dips. They make procurement rules transparent so that a small company can win a bid without knowing someone's cousin. And yes, they build data centers on their own soil with power generators and backup cooling. Because nothing digital endures without a physical backbone. Regionally, the smartest path is cooperation. No single country can do everything alone, and that's fine. A network of national platforms can be stitched together into a continental fabric. Shared standards for data protection, so a person who travels doesn't lose rights at the border. Compatible identity systems, so a startup in Dakar can sell to customers in Nairobi without reinventing the wheel. Network-level defenses against cyber attacks, where an alert in one country strengthens the rest. In public health, that means a laboratory result in one city can help a hospital in another country prepare 2 weeks earlier. In security, it means an algorithm trained to spot a pattern in one valley can recognize a cousin of that pattern across a river. What about money? Projects like this don't float on slogans. They cost, but so does dependence. The bill for lost time, lost trust, and lost leverage is paid quietly and forever. The bill for building capacity is paid loudly, upfront, and then amortized across a generation. Investors understand this when they build bridges and ports. The digital bridge is no different. You pay for concrete once. You use the road every day. I promised you a straight road and a strong ending. Here it is. The world is racing to write the rules for artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and data flows. Treaties will be drafted, technical standards will be set. The meetings will be long, the language will be arcane, and by the time it appears in your newsfeed, the deals will be done. If Africa is not in those rooms with a coordinated voice, it will arrive after the ink dries. Again, the time between now and then is a narrow window. The purpose of summits like the one in Ouagadougou is not to give speeches. It is to build confidence, systems, and alliances fast enough that when the next round of rules lands, the continent can say, "We're ready to comply where it makes sense, and we're ready to refuse where it doesn't." What does this mean for a single nation like Burkina Faso? It means measuring success by the dull metrics that actually change lives. How long it takes to register a birth, how often a permit requires cash in an envelope, how hard it is to verify a land title, how quickly a threat is detected before it becomes a tragedy. It means celebrating not just the big announcements, but the steady reduction of excuses. It means that when a service fails, The person who can fix it is close enough to answer a phone you can afford to call. What does it mean for Africa as a whole? It means acting as a block where it counts. Standards, procurement, training. It means telling the world's platforms, we welcome your partnership, but we will not sign away our rights for a discount. It means building one layer of trust on another until the idea of shipping public memory overseas without a fight becomes as strange as shipping a courthouse or a hospital. And for the world, a digitally sovereign Africa is not a threat to an open internet. It is a partner in saving it. If the only people who can afford to secure systems are those who already lead the market, the internet shrinks into a gated neighborhood. If more regions can host, manage, and defend their own services, the network becomes what it was supposed to be: resilient because it is distributed, free because power is shared, innovative because talent is everywhere, not just in the same zip codes. There is one more thought I want to leave with you, particularly if you are watching this years after the upload and wondering whether any of it came true. Progress in places you don't visit often will always look slower from far away. But ask the person standing at a counter with a number in their hand. Ask the nurse who finds a record without turning a storeroom upside down. Ask the officer who gets an alert in minutes instead of hours. Ask the young coder whose app gets adopted, not because the design is pretty, but because the translation fits, the data is local, and the system it plugs into belongs to the community it serves. In the next episode, we will follow the legal and commercial trail that shapes the global rules now being drafted for AI and data. We will look at who writes the standards, who resists them, and where the opportunities are for countries that arrive prepared. If you want to see that unravel clearly, with no jargon and no deference to buzzwords, subscribe and ring the bell. Share this with someone who still thinks digital means optional. This is a story about independence, safety, and the ability to look your children in the eye and say, we made our own path. Africa bows to no one, and if your heart still beats for freedom, you already know why that matters.